Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. You know, when you picture a parole hearing, you probably imagine this really neutral, objective search for justice, right? Well, today we're going to dive into some fascinating sociological theory that completely flips that idea on its head. It argues that New York's parole revocation hearings function way less like an actual courtroom and a lot more like a highly orchestrated theatrical play. We're going to unpack the theories behind this to see exactly how this stage is set.
Okay, here's our quick roadmap, our playbill, if you will, for today. We'll be looking at the illusion of justice, the judge as a director, how the script gets normalized, how the system casts the risky parolee, and finally, the endless performance.
Let's lift the curtain and jump straight into Section 1, the illusion of justice.
So, what's the deal here? Well, on paper, these hearings are officially framed as fair, efficient, and rehabilitative administrative proceedings. Sounds great, right? But theorists argue that this framing is basically just a mask. The theoretical reality? It's actually all about continuous, extended carceral surveillance. The hearing itself is really just a critical site where conditional liberty gets transformed into an inescapable form of control.
And to actually understand this, researchers spent 9 whole months observing a Bronx parole revocation court to build composite narratives or vignettes. This is absolutely crucial because it grounds all this heavy, high-level academic theory in the gritty, lived experiences of the people standing in that room. It shows us what conditional liberty literally looks, sounds, and feels like in the real world.
Which brings us to our next act, Section 2, the judge as director. Let's look at how power in the room is controlled.
Now, I want you to ask yourself something. In a system that's supposedly based on totally neutral fact-finding and objective legal standards, who is actually pulling the strings? Like, if we're viewing the courtroom as a theater, who decides how the actors move and speak?
To answer that, sociologists use this incredible concept called a dramaturgical framework. Basically, you literally treat the courtroom like a stage play. You analyze the legal procedures and dialogue exactly as if they were theatrical performances. It's a theoretical lens that lets us see how power operates not just through written laws, but through ritualized daily habits and predetermined roles that everyone is just expected to play.
And under this specific theoretical lens, the judge is definitely not just some neutral umpire calling balls and strikes. No, the judge is the director. They actively orchestrate the rhythm and the mood of the hearing, and they deliberately guide the flow of the conversation. And why do they do that? Well, to push the whole performance toward a very specific, institutionally prioritized outcome. It's like the end of the play is already written before anyone even takes the stage.
So now that we know who the director is, let's move to Section 3, normalizing the script.
Okay, this brings us to a massive concept from the philosopher Michel Foucault, known as discourse analysis. Foucault basically argued that institutions create their own version of truth through the very words and internal rules they use. So in the parole court, structural inequalities are reproduced simply by how people are allowed to talk, what questions get asked, what answers are deemed acceptable. The actual language of the court traps the parolee in a specific narrative.
And the outcome of all that highly controlled language? Normalization. Through the repetitive, daily grind of these courtroom rituals, absolutely wild power dynamics just become the status quo. I mean, embed these patterns through sheer repetition, and structural inequalities actually start to feel inevitable. Eventually, they look completely legitimate to the defense attorneys, the parole officers, even the parolees themselves. It just becomes standard procedure.
But you know, every play needs its characters. So let's look at Section 4, casting the risky parolee.
Think about this for a second. Before a single piece of hard evidence is ever debated, how does a court just instantly decide that the person standing in front of them is inherently a villain? How do they decide they are risky?
Well, the answer lies in scholar Asa Kuhler-Hausmann's theory of type marking. It's a process where individuals get classified into predefined permanent roles. They're branded as risky or non-compliant, not because of some deep investigation into their actual character, but based on a super quick collection of aesthetic and behavioral cues. You're basically judged and cast into your role long before you ever get a chance to speak your lines.
And the court enforces this type marking by racking up these superficial cues. Sure, part of it is the administrative record, but it relies so heavily on behavioral cues, courtroom attire, and just general demeanor. If a person doesn't have the exact posture, the right clothes, or that submissive attitude the script demands, boom, they are immediately stamped with the risky label. We can really grasp the gravity of this through Judith Butler's theory of performativity. Butler argues that identity and power aren't just things you passively have. They're active constructions produced through repeated actions. So, in the context of a hearing, the parolee doesn't just hold a risky identity. They are actively forced to perform that identity according to the court's rigid norms. They have to act out the role of the monitored, compliant subject, or they'll suffer the consequences.
And that brings us to our final act, Section 5, the endless performance. What happens when the theater doors actually close?
What this theoretical framework reveals is that carceral control absolutely does not end at the prison walls. It starts in the institution, sure, and moves to community release, but then something really insidious happens. Rehabilitative programs are essentially co-opted into surveillance tools. This creates a demand for constant self-governance. The control just bleeds out into the community, turning a person's entire life into an ongoing 24/7 audition for their own freedom.
And here's a crucial point. Even our most celebrated legal reforms usually just update the script without changing the nature of the play. Take the Supreme Court precedent Morrissey v. Brewer. It was framed as this really humane procedure, but theorists argue it actually limits actual agency by hyper-formalizing the process. Or look at New York's Less is More Act, championed as a massive procedural reform, right? Yet it still reinforces ongoing, strict supervision. These reforms sustain the illusion of individualized justice while maintaining ultimate control.
Which leads us to a phenomenon theorists call neoliberal integration. Basically, the state has franchised out its surveillance. By outsourcing supervision to community programs and carceral nonprofits, the state drastically cuts its own direct costs, while continuously extracting value from the people being watched. Those local rehab programs, they effectively become an invisible outsourced prison system.
So, ultimately, procedural updates like the Less is More Act, they just make the stage bigger. They ensure that the marginalized actor can never truly exit the play. It creates this grand illusion of justice where individuals aren't merely being supervised, they are perpetually performing their freedom under an all-encompassing carceral state. Every single day is a brand new scene where they have to prove they deserve to stay out of a physical cell.
I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought. If this theoretical reality holds true, and conditional liberty requires you to perpetually perform your freedom for the state, following a script written by a system of endless surveillance, is that actually freedom? Or is it just an inescapable, invisible cage? Keep asking those hard questions. Thanks for joining me for today's Explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.